In the small, picturesque village of Maplewood, life was simple and predictable. The villagers knew each other by name, and the smell of fresh bread from Mr. Henry Baker's shop filled the air every morning. Henry was a cheerful man in his late 50s, loved by everyone for his warm smile and delicious pastries. But one cold winter morning, the village was shaken to its core when Henry was found dead in his bakery. The discovery was made by his young assistant, Tommy, who arrived at dawn to start the day's baking. He found Henry lying on the floor near the oven, his face pale and lifeless. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident, perhaps a heart attack or a slip on the flour-dusted floor. But something about the scene didn't sit right with Tommy. He immediately called the local constable, who in turn contacted Detective Clara Hayes, a sharp and methodical investigator known for solving even the most puzzling cases. Detective Hayes arrived in Maplewood by midday. She was a tall, composed woman with a keen eye for detail and a reputation for getting to the bottom of things. The villagers watched in silence as she entered the bakery, her presence commanding both respect and curiosity. The bakery was a cozy place, with wooden shelves lined with loaves of bread and trays of pastries. The air still carried the faint scent of cinnamon and sugar, but the mood was somber. Henry's body had been moved to the side, covered with a sheet. Detective Hayes knelt beside him, carefully examining the scene. "What do we know so far?" she asked the constable, a middle-aged man named Mr. Briggs. "Not much, ma'am," Briggs replied. "Tommy found him like this early this morning. No signs of forced entry, and nothing seems to be missing. We thought it might be natural causes, but Tommy insisted something felt off." Hayes nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She noticed a few peculiar details. The oven door was slightly ajar, and a tray of burnt pastries sat inside. Henry was known for his precision-burning pastries, was unlike him. She also spotted a faint smudge of flour on the floor near the counter, as if someone had dragged something or someone across it. "Did Henry have any enemies?" Hayes asked, turning to Tommy. The young assistant shook his head. "No, everyone loved him. He was kind to everyone, even the grumpy old Mr. Fletcher, who never tips." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "What about Mr. Fletcher? Did he and Henry have any disagreements?" Tommy hesitated. "Well, there was one thing. A few days ago, Mr. Fletcher came in yelling about a missing order. He said Henry had forgotten to deliver his weekly bread, but Henry swore he'd sent it. They argued, but it didn't seem like a big deal." Detective Hayes made a note of this. She then examined Henry's body more closely. There were no visible wounds, but she noticed a faint bruise on the back of his neck, almost hidden by his collar. It was an odd place for a bruise, especially for someone who spent most of his time baking. She decided to visit Mr. Fletcher, who lived in a small cottage on the edge of the village. Fletcher was a gruff man in his 60s, with a permanent scowl and a reputation for being difficult. When Hayes arrived, he was chopping wood outside. "Mr. Fletcher, I'm Detective Hayes. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Henry Baker," she said, her tone firm but polite. Fletcher grunted, setting down his axe. "What about him?" "I heard he's dead." "Shame, but it's none of my business." "You had an argument with him recently, didn't you?" Hayes pressed. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "So what?" "He forgot my order. I was angry, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying." Hayes studied him carefully. "Where were you last night?" "Here, alone. No one can vouch for me, but I didn't leave my house," Fletcher replied, crossing his arms. Hayes thanked him and left, but she wasn't convinced. She returned to the bakery and began searching for more clues. Behind the counter, she found a small, crumpled piece of paper in the trash. It was a receipt for a large order of flour, dated the previous day. The name on the receipt was smudged, but she could make out the letters Fletch. This was the break she needed. Hayes confronted Fletcher again, this time with the receipt in hand. "Care to explain why you bought a large amount of flour yesterday, Mr. Fletcher?" You don't strike me as a baker." Fletcher's face turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Hayes said, her voice steady. "You argued with Henry because he discovered you were stealing flour from his deliveries. You confronted him last night, and things got out of hand. You didn't mean to kill him, but you panicked and tried to make it look like an accident." Fletcher's shoulders slumped, and he finally confessed, "I didn't mean to hurt him. I just wanted to scare him, but he fell and hit his head. I didn't know what to do, so I dragged him to the oven and made it look like he'd collapsed." The village was in shock when the truth came out. Mr. Fletcher was arrested, and Detective Hayes left Maplewood with another case solved. But the memory of Henry Baker, the kind-hearted baker who brought joy to so many, lingered in the hearts of the villagers, along with the bittersweet taste of justice.